Exhibiting virtual reality artworks as immersive experiences in museums and galleries is relatively uncharted territory. My interest in their intersection aligns with the overarching motivations of my current research, particularly with respect to exploring curatorial practices in a post-digital context and the development of cultural architectures from which the contemporary museum is composed. The abbreviated notes that I'm sharing here relate to a track of this research inquiry, which has been informed in a deeply situated way by my first-hand viewing experience of Mexican filmmaker Alejandro Iñárritu's celebrated Carne y Harina. Approaching VR as an exhibitionary medium extends the horizon of the art form, taking its appreciation and critique well beyond the cinematic to the cinematographic and onto the curatorial design of exhibition space itself. This observation acknowledges the deceptively obvious fact that virtual reality is experienced in real space, even if that space is in its own right a highly constructed one premised upon its own distinctive form of virtuality. Effectively breaking the dictatorship that the frame has exerted upon the representational form of the moving image since the invention of the zoetrope, it's now somewhat commonplace for VR to be extolled as a radically new paradigm for cinematic spectatorship. However, as I develop more extensively in my accompanying paper, any critical examination of the nature of its immersive experience should not be based on the visual and affective qualities of the simulated virtual image alone. This is especially so in the case of Carne y Harina. Instead, pursuing this line of inquiry transcends the limitations of the kind of subjective viewing experience that the optics and visual regime most often associated with VR reinforces by instead seeking to contextualize how the mediated experience, directed by Iñárritu, is woven narratively, scenographically, and curatorially into an integrative exhibitionary experience. Existing at the intersection of immersive storytelling, documentary filmmaking, and Hollywood visual FX cinematography, Carne y Harina certainly exemplifies the potentialities of VR as an art form. Representing Iñárritu's initial foray into VR filmmaking, Carne y Harina was awarded a special Oscar from the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences for achieving a visionary and powerful experience in storytelling. Produced in association with Lucasfilm's Immersive Entertainment Division, the ILMX Lab, Legendary Entertainment, and Fondazione Prada, Carne y Harina extends the application of digital technologies associated with computer-generated imaging beyond the virtual screen and into the real space of gallery-based installation. Speaking at the 2018 Museums in the Web conference in Vancouver, ILMX Lab executive Vicky Dobbs-Beck reinforced this point when she made the observation that the revolutionary development associated with VR shouldn't solely be put down to technological advancements in high-fidelity, real-time computer-generated graphics. Rather, what is even more groundbreaking about these technologies is the type of cross-platform, mixed-reality storytelling they enable. This observation recognizes that the quality of Carne y Harina's immersive experience is achieved through dramatization as much as digitization. In this case, the distinctive museological framing of the film itself is integral to activating the theatrical, performative, scenographic, and choreographic aspects employed by Iñárritu to achieve his stated creative intentions of blurring the lines between, I quote, a dream or reality composed within a frame, end quote. In their own respective ways, VR and museums function as multidimensional, mixed reality spaces in which aesthetic, narrative, and interpretive experiences are embedded. As I develop in greater detail in my paper, I approach how virtuality operates under exhibitionary conditions by, firstly, situating Carne y Harina, the VR film, within the enveloping curatorial design strategy of its gallery installation, and secondly, by contextualizing Carne y Harina, the exhibition, in broader curatorial terms as an exhibitionary medium. The second of these trajectories entertains a configuration of other notable VR artworks, as well as multimedial installations and immersive museum displays. In my paper, I develop upon this conceptual schema by focusing specifically on Edward Kienholz's groundbreaking environmental tableau, Five-Card Stud. Given the inherent challenges that presenting in this online format presents, I'll restrict my discussion here to providing some supplementary notes on the curatorial design of Carne Arena, whereas I will leave the tracing of the connections between the VR exhibition and Five-Card Stud to the paper itself. As indicated earlier, my interest in the curatorial issues that frame virtual reality is being positioned here by my first-hand viewing experience of Carne Arena at Fondazione Prada in Milan in 2017. There, the exhibition was installed in the Deposito, a large cavernous space incorporated into the mixed typology of the Prada Foundation's cultural complex, located on a former industrial site in the neighborhood of Largo Isarco. The curatorial design of Carne Arena was realized in this distinctive setting through a tightly controlled scenographic exhibition encounter staged across an interconnected series of bespoke temporary galleries. In brief, the exhibition itself is composed in 3 acts and designed to be experienced alone as a single participant. Following directly upon an onboarding stage, the solitary visitor immediately finds themselves in a caustically lit gray cell. A single metallic bench is located in the center of this small room, with a collection of discarded footwear lining the base of the surrounding walls. Following instructions to remove their own pair of shoes, the viewer is then left to sit alone for some minutes to contemplate their isolation and the uncertainty of the predicament they find themselves in. This embodied and performative encounter leads next onto Carne Arena's centerpiece, a hyper-reality experience that maps Iñárritu's VR film into a whole-body, multisensory, immersive entertainment platform whose realization draws upon the expertise of the Walt Disney Company's Imagineering arm and ILMX Lab's research and development into location-based immersive adventures. The spectacular quality of the real-time imagery, combined with the impressive auditory and haptic special effects simulated by an array of advanced digital technologies, effectively dissolves any separation between virtual and physical realms. And finally, in stark contrast, the exhibition concludes in a somber gallery lined with a set of video portraits recessed into its walls, in which the deeply affective personal stories of Latin American immigrants are recounted. In the midst of watching these arresting portrayals of the personal toll caused by social upheaval and political dispossession, the viewer comes to the realization that the real people telling their stories are in fact the very same people encountered earlier as avatars in the VR film. In Iñárritu's hands, VR is artfully practiced as a rich and compelling storytelling medium in which strong, empathetic relationships are formed between characters and the viewer. At its dramatic core, Carne Arena revolves upon the experiences encountered by an itinerant group of men, women, and children seeking to cross the border clandestinely from Mexico into the United States. The narrative trajectory of the film itself leads the viewer through an initial stage of orientation and acclimatization to the perceptual experience of VR itself, finding oneself assimilating with a caravan of refugees, before ultimately becoming implicated in a tense confrontational scenario between the group and U.S. Border Patrol officers. This particular scene, or more accurately, scenescape, a cinematic trope theorized in games research as a means of reinforcing the narrative context by effectively surrounding the plot, plays out in the midst of a full sensory onslaught. In the process, the viewer comes to occupy a common ground with the avatars in the film. It is right here, in sharing what Iñárritu refers to as the same, I quote, truthful alternate space, where the exchange between vision, media, and experience is rendered most palpable that sentience emerges. Curator Germano Celan ascribes this capacity to, I quote, a psychophysical unity in which, by crossing the threshold of the virtual, the human strays into the imaginary and vice versa, end quote. Situating this encounter within the museum only amplifies the communicative potential of VR, wherein, I quote, seeing is transformed into feeling and into a physical engagement with cinema, a transition from the screen to the gaze of the human being with a total immersion of the senses, end quote. Further still, by treating this observation as more than a narrow description of Carné-Irina's immersive visual experience, Celan unintentionally, it seems to me, alludes to a way of contextualizing VR as an exhibitionary medium when he summarily observes how Iñárritu's creative project embodies Fondazione Prada's experimental engagement with, I quote, the correlation between cinema, technology, and the arts, end quote. Illustratively, this correlation between Carné-Irina as VR artwork and Fondazione Prada, standing for museum, is reinforced by a set of relationships that not only extends the cinematic, but expands the scope of the work's exhibitionary context. In previous research, I put forward the proposition that it is actually the successful calibration of the viewing experience associated with VR cinema and curatorial design that achieves what might more aptly be described as a submersive, not immersive, experience. The multisensory hyperreality experience nested at Carné-Irina's core connects vision with the body in an immediate and sensate way, fusing the imaginary sense of being in the Chihuahuan desert with the presence of standing in the midst of a sand-filled gallery located in the post-industrial outskirts of Milan. Reinforced by how the scenescape functions as part of the scenario, the empathetic dimension of the VR film is amplified dramatically, thereby connecting the effective and meaningful experience of it as an artwork staged inside the museum with larger socio-political issues taking place in the world outside. By venturing a step further still, beyond the focused, physical, and spatial registration of the film's visual experience to the artwork's wider viewing context, encourages us to consider the conceptual and theoretical frames that might be called upon to describe, in the etymological sense of forming or tracing by motion, the exhibitionary conditions of virtual reality. In closing this abbreviated overview, the situatedness of my viewing encounter with Carné-Irina at Fondazione Prada underscored the subjective, felt response I had to the work, but equally opened this experience to the more serendipitous associations that the exhibition experience itself brought to mind. Guided as much by circumstance as by design, these contingent readings might be likened to the ways film montage reconstructs the spatio-temporal character of experience, where the function of editing techniques, such as jump cuts, which manipulate temporal space by fracturing the duration of a single shot, or match cuts, which create an impression of continuity by establishing visual similarity between scenes involving different, often incongruent subjects, is to set interpretive meanings in motion in a more relational and intertextual way. It was from such radical contextualization that I found myself relating my experience of Carné-Irina, then and there, to that of another artwork called from the recesses or archive of my personal memory, that being Ed Keinholz's mythical installation, Five-Card Stud, which I had the good fortune of seeing staged at Fondazione Prada only a year earlier. Propositionally, such a reading encourages a broader and enriched contextualization of VR that acknowledges its contributing spatial, performative, and museological properties. Together, these factors describe an expanded set of conditions under which the art form is exhibited and thus experienced. In spatial terms, by connecting VR with a lineage of installation art practices, including mixed media environments and tableau that develop an aesthetic of form, materialization, and participation, performatively with respect to scenography and dramaturgy, and by treating the museum as a platform for mediatized communications that offers its own kind of virtual reality.
Hello, this is Budhaditya Chattopadhyay. Greetings from Berlin. The name of my paper is Post-immersion. Post-immersion, towards a discursive situation in media arts. Immersion is a fetishized term in the domain of contemporary sound art, experimental music, audiovisual, and interactive media art, for example, VR. It is through immersion that the audience is often made to engage with the artworks, especially those involving multi-channel sound, visuals, and spatial practices. The rapid emergence of multi-channel surround sound in film and media art was possible due to its reliance on the medial dispositive of immersion to surround the audience sonically. In these works, immersion operates as a strategy to realizing the production of an illusion of non-mediation, where the presence of the technology and the medial devices are made to appear as unobtrusive as possible so as to sustain a smooth and engaging entertainment. Etymologically, the word immersion suggests a plunging or dipping into something or an absorption in some interest or situation. And when applied to sonic space or medial space in general, offers the idea that a person who enters such a space will be transformed. Immersion suggests the idea that a space, through its multitude of architectural, material, performative, and technological mediation, may wrap up or envelop an audience within it. The ability to immerse an individual who opens up the ears to its environments is related to its multisensorial modes in terms of the constructed narratives that are involved often in a suppression of a conscious subjective formation. In this contribution as a paper, I consider the immersive spaces that inherently involve context of a consumerist nature, such as sound diffusion in a live multi-channel performance in a commercially funded festival, or a commissioned interactive sound artwork, or sound design for a commercial film or VR work, or a commissioned media artwork. There is a dangerous power relationship between the producer and the consumer of the immersive works that are mediated and purpose designed so as to overwhelm and overpower the audience in order to convey and transmit directed information and knowledge of a consumerist nature. This is a fundamental problem, given the times we live in, when the analytical faculty of a subject is most needed for awareness to contemporary issues such as climate breakdown, migration, pandemic, and a police state. If we approach immersion emphasizing the often glorified design and experiential side of a space and disregard the research analytical capacity of an individual experiencing it, we might err on the side of open thinking and discourse. In fact, we should ask critically why immersion is viewed as a positive entity in a philosophical and conceptual sense. This is a make-believe fantasy land where the real is always hidden in order to create pleasure. The main concern here, however, is whether the audience tends to become a passive and non-acting guest within the immersive space, often constructed by an authoritarian and technocratic consumer corporate culture. In this mode of non-activity, the audience may lose the motivation to question the content and the context of the work by falling into a sensual and indulgent mode of experience, therefore rendering the consumerist corporate powers to take over the free will of the audience. As a result, the audience may succumb to the enveloping and engulfing power of a fantasy world created by the creative industry with economic, political, or other hegemonic intentions. From the position of a socially and environmentally conscious sound and media artist myself, I will argue for producing a more discursive environment rather than an immersive one. In the contemporary sound art and media artworks that will be conceived and produced in future, I will fervently demand a discursive space where the individuality and the questioning faculty of the audience is carefully considered and encouraged and taken into account as a parameter for a successful dissemination of the artworks. Here, discursive situation is a term that underlines the contemplative processes triggered by an artwork to interlink the artistic object and the listener's mind that apprehends it. In such a discursive mode, a media artwork can become more socially committed, responsible, responsive, and respectful towards the aware subjectivity of the audience and the mindful context within which the artistic experience is formed. However, many of the previous and current media artworks tend to glorify immersion as a dominant mode of production, diffusion, and experience. What can be a better future media art experience? Can we imagine a media artwork advocating discursivity and dissent? As Cities and Memory informs, field recording artists have been recording protests around the world to create a sound map that reflects today's political environment. What these recordings mostly contain are the shouts and screaming made by the protesters on the street. In the current state of inaction, political and social inaction, all over the world, it might be a loud earth-shaking scream that is what the future could sound like. This is when the pleasant mode of immersion can be broken, through which sounds may enter, creating a fertile premise for a condition I term post-immersion. To understand the term post-immersion, I underscore a disjunctive moment in a medial experience where the alert subjectivity of an audience is encouraged to take form. Here I refer to the philosopher Willem Plusser's notion of homeland and homelessness, which are central to his thinking. Plusser suggests that only when a person is removed from their home, he or she becomes aware of the ties which reveal themselves as unconscious judgments. The idea of homelessness is useful for my argument. The non-immersive or discursive situation I'm trying to defend here is based on the awareness of the spectator about the possibilities of loosening the ties between the cited experience and a subjective formation. This disjuncture is crucial in my own art practice as a mode to personalize an immersive experience for a self-aware critical faculty to emerge. Inspired by Plusser, I suggest 4 specific approaches to disrupt the pleasant immersion. 1, noise or a loud scream, or as an alarm mechanism. 2, asynchronism, a disjuncture between sound and image, analogous to the asynchronous mode of filmmaking as proposed by Budhaditya. 3, disrupting the narrative flow with some discursive element, such as critical commentaries, contemplative moment in a stream of thoughts, or poetic utterances. And 4, participatory intervention of the audience to activate the artwork. Such disjunctive moments in the narrative flow of a media artwork creates a sense of what Deleuze and Guattari term deterritorialization, a notion that resonates with Flusser's homelessness. Deleuze and Guattari use the term deterritorialization to describe the condition of the disembedding and re-embedding of social relations from various objects and sites. The term describes the process that decontextualizes a set of relations, rendering them remote and virtual outside of the constraint of the enveloping here and now, and preparing them for more actualizations outside a fixed local territory. Many anthropologists use the term to refer to a weakening of ties between culture and place, site and self, meaning the removal of cultural objects from a certain location in space and time for new subjectivities to form. In the context of a closed, immersive medial experience, both the ideas of homelessness and deterritorialization will help opening up the experience for personalization and subjective intervention through this weakening of the ties with the immersive space of media arts. And through this rupture, the individual audience may regain his or her critical faculty. Some of my works respond to this idea of post-immersion, such as Decomposing Landscape, installation with VR, and multi-channel video and sound at Weltkunstzimmers Düsseldorf 2018. The Unspoken, the Ineffable, From Exile and Other Syndromes 2018 at Serendipity Arts Festival, Goa. Dhwani, premiered at Experimenta Art and Science Biennale in Grenoble, February 2020. Thank you.
My name's Nick Alexander, and this is The Problem with Immersion, a presentation for Isaiah 2020. A quick word about me and my background. I'm a creator and director of immersive theater who spent some time designing escape games before completing my Masters of Design at Okai University in Digital Futures. Now, I'm interested in how emerging technologies such as AR and body tracking might help create expressive, empathetic experiences using the power of presence and performance. I'm particularly interested in bringing theater practice to bear on interaction design, and in creating unique experiences that ask the participant to take on the role of performer. There's this curious word that won't go away, despite the fact that it doesn't mean anything. It's everywhere. In advertising, art, public spaces, I'm talking, of course, about the word immersion. It's a ubiquitous word, but no one seems to agree on what it means. Academics have thrown the word away as being too vague and too broad, and replaced it with words like presence and incorporation and embodiment, but the fact is, immersion is a word people respond to, and experiences claiming to evoke immersion are becoming more and more commonplace. Immersive experiences are becoming prevalent in all kinds of media, such as in film, in theater, in gaming, advertising, galleries, product design, opera, the list goes on. I believe that immersive experience design is poised to become its own distinct discipline, but we won't be able to effectively and reliably create immersive experiences until we understand exactly what it is about them that people respond to, and are able to articulate it. To that end, I am proposing a new set of definitions for engaging with immersive design, suggesting what I think is so compelling about immersive experiences, and asserting a framework for reliably designing and deploying them. So, what is immersion? The term itself isn't particularly useful or descriptive. I've heard it defined as surrounded, covered, absorbed, distracted, submerged. It's been made to refer to video games, to films, VR, escape games, but I often feel that immersive experiences are nothing of the sort. They lack something important, something I and many others desperately seek. To many people, an immersive experience is one that surrounds you or catches you up in it. This definition seems sufficient for most practitioners, but I assert that there is a rare and misunderstood fundamental experience at the heart of immersion that people seek out, as it is magical, unique, and deeply moving. What most people seem to think of as immersion can be thought of as being synonymous with engrossment, a term borrowed from Kendall Walton, which means to be caught up in an experience to the extent that you are somewhat displaced in space and time. Engrossment can be further thought of to have two types: engrossment by form and engrossment by transportation. Engrossment by form occurs when a participant is engaged physically in a task that demands their focus to the point where they lose track of themselves in physical space. Engrossment by transportation occurs when a participant's surroundings cause them to imagine that they are located in a space that is fundamentally different than the one they are actually occupying. These are engrossing experiences, but I would hesitate to call them truly immersive. According to theater theorist Josephine Machon, a state called total immersion occurs when a participant is made to experience engrossment by form and engrossment by transportation together. Most contemporary so-called immersive experiences stop at total immersion, which I prefer to think of as total engrossment, because something's missing. The best and most evocative definition of immersion I've encountered is from Janet Murray in her seminal book, Hamlet on the Holodeck. Immersion is the pleasurable surrender of the mind to an imaginative world. I like Murray's definition because it feints at the uncanny and magical phenomenon at the heart of an immersive experience, because that pleasurable surrender is what takes an engrossing experience and makes it into a truly immersive one. From an engrossing experience, another step must be taken. There's a magic to immersion that isn't just engrossment. This is something that defies easy encapsulation. It is a fleeting feeling of wild, risky liveness, precariously balanced between play and delirium. It is allowing oneself, due to the mechanisms of engrossment and the safety of the environment, to forget that the experience is anything but true. It is a phenomenon characterized by an uncanny rush of excitement, energy, and joy. It is beyond suspension of disbelief. It is an overwriting of the unspoken rules that govern our universe, a kind of structured hallucination, a performance the experient is invited to undertake, to actualize, and to affect. It is a rare and a beautiful thing, and it is what I believe forms the core of the truly immersive experience. It is what makes immersion such an attractive, magical, fleeting, wonderful phenomenon, and what makes it so hard to articulate. This is a state that I've been calling embodied présence. Présence is a term from Josephine Machon referring to the fleeting ephemerality of live performance, and it should be the goal of any designer of an immersive experience. Of course, it's not so easy to entice participants to take that extra step. This challenge, I'm sure, will be a huge focus of immersive designers. One solution is the application of community. A shared community undergoing immersion together will experience what Mike Pohjola calls interimmersion, where engagement with the fiction becomes a performance for the benefit of other participants, who in turn perform and help reinforce the notion that the rules of the world have changed. If a community can agree and support the experience of immersion, that experience becomes stronger and more pleasurable for everybody. Thus, I suggest that a designer of an immersive experience follow this framework. Attempt to create an environment in which a participant can pursue a physical activity in a space that invites imagination, and thus experience engrossment by form and engrossment by transportation simultaneously, and achieve the state of total engrossment. From here, the designer should gently invite the participant to take a step into embodied présence, that pleasurable surrender described by Murray. This can be aided by inviting a community of like-minded participants along, whose shared experience will incite interimmersion, justifying and strengthening the immersion of the whole group. The fandoms that spring up around games like Dragon Age are prime examples of this framework in action. Though Dragon Age is a solo game, players become deeply attached to the world and its characters, through the characters they themselves inhabit and personify. They share artwork, stories, anecdotes, and insights about their shared experience in the world of Thedas, a world that, in a very real way, they have spent time immersed in. The game itself generates engrossment by form and by transportation, and the supportive community allows players to invest themselves in their characters beyond the scope of the game, becoming immersed in the fiction in a way the designers did not necessarily intend. The problem with immersion is that it is everything and nothing. It means too much and communicates too little. It isn't a useful term to communicate the depths of what it is capable of, despite the fact that so many people crave it, and that it is about to evolve into its own distinct medium. This framework is a step in locking down what we are after when we talk about immersion, which will let us design for it. It proposes clarifications to confusing nomenclature and articulates the uncanny, phenomenological heart of immersion that defies easy definition but is so attractive and so resonant to so many. Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Norbert Peiheng Zhao. Welcome to my presentation about my paper for ICEA 2020. The title of the paper is Intercultural Dialogue in Museums Through Mixed Reality. This paper comes from the early stage research of my thesis. Please allow me to introduce myself and the co-author Dr. Alexis Morris. I'm a designer, writer, and curator. I graduated with a Master of Design in the Digital Futures program at Okada University. Currently, I'm working as a UX designer in Toronto. Dr. Alexis Morris is an assistant professor in the Digital Futures program, the director of the Adaptive Context Environment Lab at Okada University, and Canada Research Chair in the Internet of Things. This presentation has 5 sections. I will start with introducing my motivations, my theoretical design to my early stage prototypings. Also, I'd like to show my current and the future work. I will end up with some final thoughts of the research. In recent years, the concept of intercultural dialogue has attracted considerable attention. It can be seen as a meaningful mediation for the current world, where localism, populism, and the far right are on the rise, as it brings people from different cultures together and aims to exchange diverse perspectives and practices. But in my research, the intercultural dialogue I am talking about is not just about understanding the differences between different groups. It's also crucial for different groups to realize and recognize the similarities they are sharing. For example, in this slide, you can see my favorite Chinese-style garden in Shanghai. It is a mosque with almost 700 years of history. The whole mosque is a masterpiece of classical Chinese garden that represents the traditional Confucianism philosophy and aesthetics. It also makes the teaching of Islam and Islamic art. Since artifacts are so important for cross-cultural conversation, how do museums deal with it? In many museums, collections are classified according to their cultural origins. This common museological approach minimizes the impact of interactions between people and of change over time. Take the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City as an example. I took 3 pictures from the European Sculpture Gallery, the Chinese Art Gallery, and the early 20th century European Paintings Gallery. They are in 3 distinct locations in the museum. Few visitors would associate them with one another, but classical Greek culture profoundly influenced Buddhism art in India, which then spread to China and throughout East Asia. And the post-impressionist artists, led by Van Gogh, got a lot of inspiration on Japanese and other East Asian art. The connections between these cultures are not displayed in the museum space. What the audience gets is the experience of seeing exhibitions separated from each other. This common museological approach minimizes the impact of interactions between people and of their cultures. So what kind of technology can be used to help solve this problem? The first thing came up in my mind is mixed reality technology. Mixed reality, MR, is a general term for various visual display technologies that involve the transformation of real and virtual worlds. It can be shown in the virtuality continuum as a figure here. Which is in between the completely real environments to completely virtual environments. Why do I think this technology has unlimited possibilities to help museums break through the boundaries and transform artifacts into a medium for cross-cultural conversation? Take AR, the best-known type of MR, as an example. It combines the real and virtual content, which means it can add endless layers of computer graphics on top of the current world. In this way, it breaks the physical limitations of space. It is interactive in real time. Also, it is registered in 3D, which means it can increase the engagement for users. Therefore, recently, a growing number of museums are embracing AR for enhancing public engagement and education. Therefore, those motivations lead to my research questions, which is, how can mixed reality help to represent cross-cultural links between artifacts and facilitate intercultural dialogue for the visitor at the museum? In order to answer my research question, I choose blue and white pottery as a case study to conduct in-depth research and develop my prototype. I choose the blue and white potteries from Safavid Iran and Ming China. By using the research through critical design methodology, I developed a diagram to show my research process. It can be divided into two parts. As you can see in this diagram, first, in the top part, I developed the theoretical model that artifacts can be used as important agents for representing the intercultural links. By analyzing the literature and case study of blue and white pottery from China and Iran, then in the bottom section, I used the iterative prototyping and user testing as methods to develop the prototype to examine the theoretical model I developed. Before getting into my current work on this topic, blue and white, I want to introduce the two early stage prototypes presented in the paper. The first one is a VR multicultural gallery. VR was the first digital medium that came into my mind when I started exploring how to build a digital platform for the promotion of intercultural dialogue in museums. The development of this experiment started in June 2019 by using a 360 camera. I took 360 videos from 3 galleries in the Art Gallery of Ontario, the Canadian Painting Gallery, the Henry Moore Sculpture Gallery, and the special exhibition titled Brain Dziekan. In Unity, I built 3 spaces to show each 360 video. Meanwhile, I added 3D scans into different galleries and tried to create a new parallel display of the real exhibition and the virtual artifacts. I put 3 virtual objects from the British Museum into each virtual gallery. In the gallery of the Henry Moore Sculpture Center, I installed a statue of a priest from Cyprus in the middle. By putting them beside each other, I tried to create a conversation between this ancient statue and the semi-abstract sculptures from AGO. This virtual gallery allows users to compare and appreciate the similarities, differences, and connections between the artifacts which are separated in different spaces in the real world. In the rest of the gallery, I also installed virtual objects with a similar theme, but from a different historical period. After the first prototype, I started to learn how to use AR technology to build a mobile device-based experience. I made an AR map to learn the skill of image tracking. When the user scans the map with the built-in camera on their phone, a 3D virtual image of the artwork will be displayed in the corresponding gallery space on the map. To break the conventional visiting approach, the museum can show the dialogues of cultures on this AR map by visualizing the links between artifacts on the interactive map. After the exploration of several early stage prototypes, I started my current prototype, blue and white, to demonstrate how AR can be used to present the story of how the historical knowledge exchange between Ming China and Safavid Iran shaped the blue and white pottery. I found that blue pigment and lotus motif are 2 representative intersections between the Chinese and Persian blue and white pottery. I visualized this information into this diagram. After scanning the artifact, other 3D artifacts that have historical connections with the scanned one will be displayed on the iPad screen. There are also descriptions of these artifacts, such as country of origin, date, and size. Meanwhile, visitors can click the labels that popped up with the virtual objects and get more information about the connections between these artifacts. In the case study of blue and white, visitors can receive the stories about how blue pigment from Persia and the lotus motif from China affected the blue and white pottery in each culture. It helps visitors find the links between seemingly isolated cultures. I also conducted a series of user testing for this prototype. Also, I summarized the utilization of MR feature in the prototype and its future potential in museums. Based on the results of the user testing and the comparison, MR technology, especially AR, in this case, can be used as an effective means to represent the intercultural links between artifacts from different cultures and stimulate visitors to reassess the relationship between these cultures. Also, my research promises to raise the awareness about the importance of artifacts as agents for promoting intercultural dialogues. However, to achieve the larger picture of the ideas in the future, the further development of mixed reality, artificial intelligence, and mass databases for the museum collections are still very necessary. Thank you.
Okay, those are excellent presentations. I have some questions for everyone first. I first want to sort of examine the title of the talks. For everybody, what are the main areas for you of interest of how immersion is problematic? Terminology, functionality, history, semantics.
All of the above.
Right?
Yes, agreed. Largely that it is utterly meaningless. It's something that people seem to respond to very viscerally, and yet you can't really have a conversation about it. You can't really explain what it is or why it's effective.
I think it limits the ontological and epistemological for somatic and phenomenological. This limitation is at the core of the problem of immersion.
Yeah, I think for my research, because it's about the museum visiting, so like when you make it like a fully immersive, like it will let the visitors to ignore the artifacts in the museum. So that's why I choose the mixed reality. So I'm trying to find the balance between the physical experience and the immersive experience.
Very good. Next question. Sorry, echo. It's interesting that several of you are using mixed reality. I'm a kind of old school augmented reality. I did a lot of work in locative media, but again, I'm your moderator. But just to give it context, it's not about me. But it's interesting historically in terms of terminology. Mixed reality had a lot of talk about 20 years ago, and then augmented reality came to the fore. And now in your research and your work, you're kind of pushing AR to a specific point and bringing mixed reality forward as a more inclusive terminology. I think that's fascinating. I'd love to know why that is that you're exploring it that way.
The idea of what you just raised there around sort of the inclusive, you know, the notion of inclusive terminologies and developing, I guess, a more embracive or an idea that kind of embraces a wider range of realities. And to me, that kind of is sort of where the challenge from my research, focusing primarily on the curatorial and the I guess kind of the integration of VR within sort of museum paradigms, is about looking at kind of a way to bridge bridge those worlds, and to kind of bring the understanding of the technological that we kind of relate to mixed reality and augmented reality and virtual reality and all of those to a broader context, which in my case is looking at kind of the cultural the cultural spaces and the cultural architectures that we find those technologies and art forms sort of working within.
It seems to me that the term augmented reality places the reality portion at the center and suggests that the augmentations are secondary. And with the development of technology and the fact that we're now in this place where the technological component can and often is the central component of the experience, that it's no longer necessarily honest to describe an experience as an augmented reality one. The line between where reality ends and the technology begins is now so blurred that it seems to me that just in general mixed reality is a stronger starting point if you're going to be discussing this wide bin of different experiences that we can concoct.
Next question. I'm curious, are you more interested in Cartesian space, non-Cartesian space, or a collision of the two? Since you're talking about a mix of aesthetics and data and experience.
Is that directed at anyone in particular, or is
no?
That
That's
just...
these first ones are free for everybody.
Again, I think kind of it's the collision, the combination, the cross fertilization, again the movement, that kind of happens across those spaces, and the conceptualizations of those spaces. That's really the kind of the exciting and the challenging thing. So hence, the challenge, of course, in terms of how do we talk about it? How do we actually describe? And how do we actually work with that? How do we demonstrate it? How do we practice it? How do we see it and feel it? How do we know it? Those are kind of the I guess kind of the widest kind of array of challenges that this kind of bubbles up.
Right.
Like personally, I think it's a very interesting term to use the collision, because for my research in the museum, like I prefer to see the technology only as a facilitator. I would say the concentration in the experience still on the artifacts and the physical experience. Like the mixed reality technology is only being used to like improve and enhance the experience and to gain more knowledge.
Next question. I feel like I'm acting like a game. I feel like I'm being a game show. So historically, in the terminology of immersive spaces, a convex screen, some used to argue in the world of theory that if you took a bowl or a curved dish and projected an image, because that changes the flat plane, it becomes immersive. And there's even, I live in Los Angeles, there's even a ride at Universal Studios near me, and it's The Simpsons, and it appears to be immersive, and it's just a convex screen. Another historical reference, there was multi-screen cinema in the late 60s and 70s, and so you'd have say a front screen, side screens, top screen. One was the perspective of a box of popcorn, and a big hand comes in. Those are considered immersive spaces. In your current research and where you see the future going, again, for everybody, how do you personally define immersive space, and where do you see or want it to be going?
It's that kind of question that started me off on my research, because I was working in immersive theater, and my collaborators were getting very frustrated when we encountered installations like that called themselves immersive. We were really trying to engage with the exchange of experience and performance between people, and take it one step further than simply being surrounded by colorful walls. So that's a question that really hits me where I live. And that's why I embarked on my research, because I realized that it's no longer effective to simply throw the term immersion around without really understanding what we're talking about. If we can all agree that an immersive experience is one that's surrounding space, then that's fine. But I think that because we're now engaging with it at a more sophisticated level, we need to be establishing terminology that really communicates our meanings and our intentions, especially if it's now something that we're mindfully designing for.
We can understand immersion also in terms of the technological development. Like Francis Dyson pointed out, the transition from looking at to being in. So this transition is happening through, for example, monaural sound to stereophonic sound to multi-channel Dolby Atmos kind of experiences. So this shift is also directing towards the future of immersion, perhaps. So this is just an input, an afterthought.
Yeah, and the thing I would kind of add to that is just going back to kind of sort of what Nick was saying about kind of theater and kind of, I guess, kind of the conventions and the kind of the architectures that again kind of support this sense of immersion. How what we're kind of interested in here is the way that those kind of forms that we're kind of bringing forward, how they are being challenged, how they maybe need to be reformed, in relation to this. So in terms of, let's say, museums, of course, the gallery space, the rectilinear kind of architecture that goes, of course, well back to, Chattopadhyay as an example. And of course, in art historical terms, the idea that virtuality is kind of sort of premised on sort of understanding how that real space actually kind of sets up certain conditions in order to have a virtual experience, to in a sense move from being kind of in a three-dimensional environment and being able to see through a two-dimensional representation into another three-dimensional kind of virtual environment. And of course, those kind of architectures are kind of things that kind of paradigmatically, I guess, kind of bring, are pulled forward, and how we sort of recognize that, with the technologies that are available to us, but also with kind of the cultural, I guess, kind of vernaculars, our changing vocabularies, our changing kind of needs and wants, all of those kind of issues kind of come together here.
Sorry, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah, the disruptive frontality of interaction, like stage art objects that are kept within a museum or gallery space that you interact frontally. This frontality is broken when immersion as a medial devices is used. So something to think about as well, like pictorial experience. Often, like Jonathan Stern has suggested that there is an audiovisual litany, and immersion is more appropriate for sonic experiences than visual experiences. But other scholars have pointed out that immersion is also a pictorial experience, and frontality, and how we experience like a landscape painting, large landscape painting, large canvases. So these inputs are contradictory, and we need to also think about whether it's an oral or audiovisual or visual only experience when we discuss immersion.
There's an excellent question. Oh, echo. Check 1 2 2. Sorry, Rody passed. There's a question in the chat from Sojung. How has the pandemic affected the immersive experience around artworks? How could you push it to a space that's not just a virtual presentation? That's a good question for everyone.
I mean, this question is very hard to answer because like nobody expects this pandemic, especially for the museum visiting. Like
Right.
for 4 months, like billions of people couldn't visit the museum. But like personally, from my perspective in my research, like I would say like you can use mixed reality to shift all the daily object in your bedroom into a museum object. For example, like the point of my research is to use mixed reality to tell the story between different cultures, but the object is the representation of the cultures. So for example, you have like a printed poster in your bedroom, but like you can use mixed reality technology to change it into similar painting from the museum. So you don't need to go to the museum, but you can still learn the culture background and the intercultural exchange between these objects, like by using your like own like $10 print poster. Yeah, I think that's my answer.
Yeah, no, I think that was a really nice kind of way to sort of describe that. And I'm thinking actually of sort of some of the teaching that I'm doing at the moment with students, and having kind of taught a program in sort of designing for culture and heritage. Of course, the way that we would normally teach that class would be to actually sort of engage with a physical museum, think about kind of an exhibition display or curating an exhibition in a gallery space. And in a sense, everything has had to kind of, from an educational standpoint, move across into online mode. And hence, we're dealing with the digital museum, shall we say, or the virtual museum. We're dealing with digital objects as opposed to physical artifacts. We're creating not just exhibitions, but you're creating different kind of curated experiences. And those experiences, of course, could happen at home, the whole kind of museum at home, kind of hashtag museum at home sort of movement. So it's kind of also, I think, about then sort of how the museum using the museum kind of in a very, very generalized way to talk about all the things that we've just been talking about, is actually pervasive. It's not just kind of a destination that's kind of, defined or restricted, by its physical place and its architecture, but it becomes a pervasive concept, and it kind of permeates, culture, and it permeates kind of the way that we work or that we engage socially, and that's exciting, I think, as far as how these technologies might, enable that to happen or demonstrate how that can have a purpose. And of course, those purposes could be more entertainment oriented, of course, at one end of the scale. But I think the other really important thing that I think most people kind of touched on in their presentations was how important that is to kind of, engaging socially, engaging kind of meaningfully with social relations, and of course the politics that kind of surround that, and for VR then to be actually, or mixed reality to really be a way of critically engaging in the world as opposed to escaping from it.
In maybe a macabre sense, there's a bit of an opportunity, what with social distancing, to re-examine how and why immersive experiences are effective. And it's really highlighted to me that the most effective immersive experiences are about the relationship between the participant and the actual space. So maybe there is a bit of an opportunity here when we are designing experiences for lockdown to really engage with the relationship between a person and the space that they're in the way that Norbert and Vince were talking about, is maybe turning a familiar residential space into a gallery space, or exploring the way that the space you're inhabiting affects a social dynamic. I would assert that there's no necessity to leave your house to develop an immersive experience. It's all about how the space and the interaction that you're developing affects the participants.
I'm also thinking about the first telephonic conversation between Edison and his assistant Watson. Hey Watson, come over. So there is always this desire for presence and any kind of like remote interaction. This desire of presence is embedded always. And in like we are having a conversation here, there is a frontality that I can see you in a little box. But how can we think about presence and how can we construe presence within this frontal conversation? Maybe through more personal experiences or more personalization of the conversation that we are having. Like, for example, in some of the presentations I had heard a cat, pet cat is meowing from off-screen space, and that kind of breaks the ice, you know. So those kind of personalizations, maybe you can think about for a future zoomed out conversation. But because world is not moving very fast, we need to be confined in our flats, maybe few more months, maybe a year, or maybe 2 years, who knows.
We'll see.
I can also think about teleportation. Can we imagine ourselves transported as hologramic images just in your on your sofa, and we can have a conversation side by side?
I would love that. I would love that.
I would love that too.
Yeah.
Okay.
That would be better than Zoom for me. I'm tired of teaching on Zoom.
Sure.
So there's a question in the chat for Vince. Your main example seemingly displayed a vast industrial factory venue of carne y urina using VR goggles. How does the device expand the space of a VR person is inside? And how can a museum recreate such a site-specific scenography if that scenography is actually to augment virtual reality? Interesting question.
Trying to sort of follow the parts of that, but in terms of sort of that particular sort of work, you know, the space in which kind of the Carne Arena was staged was, designed in a bespoke fashion, but kind of still conformed to, in a sense, the gallery, I guess, kind of footprint in terms of sort of having kind of gallery spaces that your whole experience of the exhibition was kind of interlinked between those spaces. Of course, the centerpiece and the focal point being kind of the VR film, you know, occurs kind of in this sort of central space, which is kind of theatrical. It's kind of sort of like a sound stage. And so if you think of kind of other types of, I guess, again, cultural architectures, if you think of, for instance, here in Melbourne with the Australian Centre for the Moving Image, the Screen Gallery, which, you know, for the past 20 years kind of was basically this, an empty hangar, effectively, that could kind of be designed as necessary to kind of host, you know, the types of interactive and, in cases, immersive experiences. I guess and you know, with Carne Arena, of course, as well, the nature of the viewing experience is not one that you're kind of, I guess, kind of fixed, like many VR, I guess, kind of presentations, let's say, in spaces, as opposed to maybe exhibits, are often kind of, you know, sit down on this chair, put the headset on and have a VR experience. And even if you are in a gallery kind of setting, you know, that's kind of about the dimension of that. With Carne Arena, the opportunity was to kind of be tethered with a backpack, and therefore your kind of ability to actually kind of move in a more kind of expansive way while still tethered was quite an obvious part of the design strategy. But the other thing was, and what I've written about, is that it's really kind of crucial to the, I guess, appreciation, the understanding, and I guess the gravitas of the experience that you have with the film component of that work, is the fact that it is also kind of that episode, let's say, is nested within a curatorial strategy that actually plays out over a series of spaces in which you have different types of experiences throughout, and together that really kind of creates the work itself.
Hmm. Last free-for-all question, last game show question. A classic golden nugget in much of things related to technology and creativity, the man-machine or human dichotomy. So if you're talking about a technologically mediated experience, both by creator and by observer, where do you draw the dynamics for you in your work, or in terms of what most interests you in immersion, the hierarchy between the person and the machine, the cybernetic organism, if you will? I can rephrase it if you want.
I'll hit it. I'll hit that one. And I don't know if it's really kind of an answer, but I want to say that I've been kind of actually quite inspired over the last few days with, and granted here in Melbourne means that I've kind of dipped in and dipped out of presentations in order to still get some sleep. But the things that I've kind of noticed, even in just this kind of patchwork of kind of presentations that I've been able to sort of zoom into, is really kind of some of the discussion that seems to kind of really bring somebody like Gilbert Simondon onto the stage, and kind of ideas around transduction, ideas around individuation. And I do feel that there's kind of opportunity, and more than opportunity, there's a real relevance to kind of understand mixed reality and VR, through those kind of theoretical frames. So that's really kind of resonated in presentations that I've kind of seen, where people are engaging with those types of issues around particular works, and dealing with cultural heritage, in fact, with some of those ideas in mind. So I've just wanted to say I found that kind of an inspiring kind of aspect of some of these discussions, which I think kind of is really around the core of that question, and this notion of, I guess, kind of the technical objects and the like. Yeah.
This one is for Nick or anyone else that wants to answer. Two things that are really interesting from your presentation: the construct of structured hallucination. Some used to argue that in terms of immersive visualization in an older context, that's what a good book could do. I'm curious how that relates to your practice. And it's really interesting that you said let's not use immersion anymore. It's too tainted, too problematic. Can you talk a bit more about engrossment? Because that's an interesting shift in terminology.
Sure. So I'm glad you mentioned the book, because that was one of the core inspirations for the new framework, or for beginning to think about the new framework, because I totally agree. There's an absolute magic and wonderment into getting lost in a good book. So this idea is nothing new. And I think that, and I have experienced, and I know other people have too, a similar kind of transportation occurring in these experiences. So it's an opportunity for us to pull in all of these new technologies and all these new practices to really kind of begin to build a new art form, and maybe reach the kind of heights that really wonderful literature can achieve. Can you just repeat the second part of that question for me?
I don't remember. Hold on.
It was about engrossment.
Why is it so important to you to shift out of immersion to engrossment? I have in my notes, caught up, displaced by form and transportation. Why is that crucial?
That's crucial because these were definitions that I encountered that also were referred to as immersion in different fields. I looked at VR, I looked at video gaming, I looked at movies and books, and there's the word gets thrown around everywhere, but sort of the actual technical, practical experiences that people go through generally can actually be called engrossing without being what I would think of as immersing. Like you can be doing a crossword and get kind of get lost in time. Does that mean you've been immersed? I would argue that means you've been engrossed, because I would hesitate, and I'm sure a few others would agree that that is an immersive experience. So in order to start having these conversations about what we are really talking about when we're talking about immersion, we have to first say what immersion is not. In my research, I started thinking like, well, then we need a term for these things that we do that are ingredients of the more holistic immersive experience, but don't reach the levels of the structure hallucination that literature can bring on. So that's where engrossment came from. In summary, like engrossment is sort of like a practical, it's like a task almost. And then immersion, or whatever term we end up using, is like the mind blown, there's magic happening. Yeah, in theater they talk about magic a lot, so that's sort of where my jumping off point was. Like, if you're like the mass hallucination of being in the theater and not just having the suspension of disbelief, but really being moved by really moving theater, was sort of the touch point, the jumping off point for the understanding that there's something magical and transcendental at the core of these immersive experiences that these kind of conversations weren't really reaching at, for me.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Go ahead.
I'm just thinking about different stages of immersion. For example, it's theorized such as there are 3 different levels of immersion. First is engagement, then engrossment, and then total immersion. So if you prefer engrossment, then you are thinking about the second stage of immersion. But there is a first stage, is engagement. I would personally advocate for engagement, because then there is the power relationship between the producer of the experience and the one who is receiving it is more equal. So this equality is something I have underscored in my paper. In the engagement level, this equality is kind of maintained. But I'm also thinking about cathartic experiences. Like in certain experiences, cinematic or musical or artistic experiences, there is a catharsis happening. How do you conceptualize cathartic experiences, which is either engrossment or engagement or total immersion?
My response would be, sorry.
No, go ahead.
My response would be that you need that total immersion, or whatever term we end up using for that, to reach those levels. Because I feel that there's still a level of distance. I'm really glad to be having this conversation, because I have yet to really encounter anyone who's critical of immersion, or who has a sense that it might be misused. And from both my practice and my research, I've started to grapple with these questions, but I've also sort of felt that until we're able, like I have been able to articulate the extent to which I'm trying to design or build these things. I feel like this is such an incannabular media that until it's well established enough to be able to critique, we won't be able to effectively critique it, because we won't really know what it is we're critiquing.
That dovetails perfectly into, I want to make sure I don't run out of time for Norbert. I have a couple questions for you, but for Budhaditya, it's a 2-parter. So the general construct, and I have to confess, I wrote papers in the past that I'm now questioning after this discussion, which is really good. The general easy metaphor for immersion is someone swimming underwater in a pool. You no longer can hear anything, you can't see anything, you're completely in this other space. But what I really found interesting in your talk is almost like your equation was that can be drowning in authorial intent, subtext, without the necessary autonomy of the viewer. So the second part is, you mentioned that things like pandemic and climate change necessitate a discursive space and more of an asynchronous functionality. That's fascinating because it goes against the general paradigm. Can you talk about that a little bit more?
The subjective formation is something I underline. Subjective formation in the sense that the critical faculty of the audience, of the listener or the viewer, is encouraged. A critical faculty, which is I call discursive moment. This discursive moment must be there. Otherwise, this drowning that you mentioned, the drowning in the experience would be problematic, because then there is a hegemonic relationship between the producer and the audience, which can be misused, through which many like false truths or fake news can be used, or because the vulnerability of the audience is there, because the critical faculty is missing in a total immersion. So I'm thinking about whether it's possible to nurture the critical faculty discursive through a discursive moment, emergence of a discursive moment. That is my response.
Yeah, that's
Maybe
really interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, so Norbert, make sure that you get your questions here. So yours is also very interesting. I'll ask you 2 questions because we only have about 9 minutes, and then there's another question for everybody if we have time. In the general curatorial realm, in the old history, you could argue that an architectural space is sort of immersive in the sense that you're in the museum. Like if you go to Las Vegas, you don't have windows, so it's an immersive space in a more constrictive sense. How pervasive do you think it is that there's this cultural isolationism in exhibitions? Is that in most museums, would you say? How problematic do you think that is?
Yeah, I would say like the focus in my research about the Universal Museum, like the so-called Universal Museum, like the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the British Museum, or the Royal Ontario Museum, like they display all the artifacts from many like colonies, like for example, like from Chinese art, Indian art, and the indigenous art. Like my isolation means the isolation in my argument doesn't mean like they are not in the same space. It means they are displayed in separated spaces. Because think about when you visit the Metropolitan Museum of Art in NYC, like the 4th floor is about that. It's always the European art. They are always in the most visited gallery, and you don't like think about like they have the historical exchange with, for example, the Islamic art or Chinese art. Like that is the isolation. I mean, like the perception of the visitors when they visit these separated cultural galleries. Yeah, that's my answer.
Okay, very good. My next question, if it's a bad question, let me know and I'll toss you another one. But I'm gonna toss it out there anywhere for Norbert.
I'm not going to say it's a bad question.
Thank you. You're awesome. Your focus was blue and white, and in a lot of classic aesthetics, you go into color symbolism, but they're also culturally mediated. So when you talk about blue and white, and there's a separation in something like that museum, those symbolisms, especially in historical artifacts, would be different culturally. How could we better address in your function of your work addressing that problem?
Sorry,
creating more.
The second part of the question.
So the symbolism inherent to certain works is not explained by a plaque in a museum. I say this as a sometimes curator. That's an issue that kind of erases cultural history and resonance and context. How could something like what you're developing address that in terms of an intersection?
I think the thing I'm developing is not like erasing like the current display. It's more like to expand the exhibition. like to expand the narrative, because for now, like for example, like blue and white is just a case study to approve my argument. Like I use one object from the Aga Khan Museum, which is an Islamic art museum, and another porcelain from Ming China, and from another museum. Like they are so separated. Like you visit different museum, like you never see them at the same time. But in the time I'm developing, you can simply use the digital device to see them at the same time, at the same space. So like I don't need to tell you anything. Like you just need to look at them, and you will be wondering like why they look so similar. So the visitor will go to.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I think that's my answer.
Yeah, so it's autonomy. Okay, interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, a question for everybody. Are you more interested in terms of mixed reality and mediation of space, in terms of engagement or intervention? It's a classic augmented reality debate, of course.
In particular, with an eye to immersive experiences, or with simply with augmented reality?
And the works that you've studied and the works that you're creating, is it more creating a connected layer or skin to something that already exists, be it physical space, existing artifacts, or is it more an intervention creating a sort of collision to raise more autonomy or awareness in the viewer? It seems like there's a range of that in your work. That's why I was curious.
The way it's been applied is the former, I think. For the most part, these experiences are often like promotional experiences. And there isn't much concern with engagement beyond communicating a product byline or something like that. But I think we're reaching a point where we can start to be a little bit more critical and start devising these engagements with a message, with an emotional takeaway. And that's what's so exciting and what's so sort of nerve-wracking about it, because we don't have it hasn't been around long enough really beyond being a like marketing tool for us to really start engaging and understanding what we're really doing to the brains of the people who are engaging with it. Especially to the extent, like there was a message on the chat, someone mentioned like mindlessness, that like the sort of total engrossment that we're talking about can lead to mindlessness rather than mindfulness. And I think that's absolutely true. And I think that as creators, we have to start understanding that this kind of intervention can really like overwrite reality if it's given the right resources. So I don't know if that actually answers the question, but that's
that you won a new car. That was a good answer. Anybody else, or I have another one.
I would just like to jump in and say that
sure.
I would always prefer artists like Lawrence Abu Hamdan over Ryoji Ikeda. I'll be always critical of Ryoji Ikeda's work. This is my personal kind of preference and advocation.
Okay, last question. Oh, we have 2 minutes left. Dang. Okay, so this will be a wrap it up question. This has been a very interesting discussion. How do you see the relationship to something like game spaces? But how are you going to avoid problems like VR shot games, or people that get so immersed that their body actually there's an issue in VR gaming, for example, where if the game's really immersive, people get sick because it throws off their equilibrium. How do you deal with those issues in what you're working in?
I think you need to pick and choose what from the practice you pull in. Certainly game elements are relevant in immersive experiences, but they don't necessarily have to be fully gamified or actually be games. There's lessons you can learn from studying game design, just like there's lessons you can learn from studying curatorial practice that can be applied in an immersive experience, but there's no need to lean one way too far or the other. And oftentimes it also depends on the technology that's being pulled in. Like VR motion sickness is a real problem. So if that's something that you're encountering, does VR necessarily need to be part of the stack?
Mm. That's true. We have 1 minute left. So anything else you want to add before the stream ends? Or any questions for each other in the last 30 seconds?
How we can imagine artworks, so-called immersive artworks, using immersive technologies, more socio-politically critical of our times, and more active in this, like activist, in the sense that I was mentioning Lorenzo Bohamdan's work over Rio Dziekan. So how do you imagine such future works?
I think experimentation is happening and needs to happen, but my answer to that is that I can't imagine them yet because the affordances of this field have not yet been fully plumbed. So when we really encounter something that's really transcendental and really meaningful, and has a real cultural effect, it'll be something that we didn't expect.
Thank you.
Thank you. I could answer, but I think we're out of time and I'm your moderator. But that's something that if you ever want to talk outside of this, I'd love to talk more. That's very important.
Yeah.
It was a wonderful conversation, and I would I prefer to continue this, but we are running out of time.
Yeah.
In this occasion.
Yeah. Maybe we should meet somewhere virtually later on.
Sure.
Sounds like fun.
Yeah. You teleport.
Yeah, we need to
Teleport. Yeah, let's teleport.
Absolutely.